Hey there, Emma here, and we need to talk. We need to talk about values. If you have never heard of the term values when it comes to art before, it's not about integrity, honesty, or kindness, although those are really great, but in watercolour, value refers to the lightness or darkness of a colour on a scale between white and black. So a colour's deepest value is when it's at its most saturated, it's pure colour, fresh out of the tube, barely any water in the mixture. And the lightest value is the lightest it can be before disappearing after we dilute it with lots of water. But why does this even matter? What's the big deal about values? Well, without values, paintings can lack contrast and everything just looks a bit flat. We need a range of values to make our paintings look interesting, but we also need to match them to a reference photo if what we're seeking is realism. Values create a light source and shadows in a painting. They give the subjects and shapes within them depth and dimension. They can create a focal point or several, as well as helping guide someone's eyes through a painting. They can also create emotion and mood, as well as distance and depth by bringing things forward or pushing them backwards. What about colour? I hear you demanding after we just spent weeks talking about colour mixing. Many people think that colour is the most important part of a painting with watercolours, but value is far more important, I believe. And the cool thing about values is if you can nail them, then you can completely mess with the colours of a painting and still have it look real or like the subject should. Getting the values right gives you some more freedom to just have fun and play around with all the colours. But another thing worth noting about colour is that individual colours have their own limitations when it comes to how many values that they can actually achieve. Colours that are lighter on the value scale at their darkest will have less values than a colour that is very dark at its darkest. So try it yourself. Choose a colour from your collection or mix one up with your primaries and swatch it at its most saturated. Then dip your brush, just like half of the brush, in a bit of water. Don't swish any colour off. You can dab any excess moisture off on paper towel and paint another swatch next to it. Then rinse and repeat, and this should create a slightly lighter colour each time. Continue until you've almost got a clear swatch, and then congrats, you just made a value chart, and that's going to show you how far you can stretch that particular colour. Try it with other colours in your collection as well, just to see how many possibilities you can get from each one. Creating a value chart that extensive can be a little bit overwhelming though, like, oh great, now I have 20 different shades that I have to worry about plus colour. So what you might want to do instead is just create one by eye with about 5 different shades. Just try and get yourself a highlight, a shadow, and a mid-tone, and then try and get a colour on either side of that mid-tone in between all 3. And that's just going to give you a much more approachable value scale and a lot more practical when it comes to matching that up with paintings. I'm going to show you another value chart here using Winsor Lemon, and the purpose behind that is what I showed in last week's video about colour schemes, was that some colours just don't have that same depth, and you do have to consider things like that when you are really needing to shade an area. Lighter colours like yellows and oranges just don't often always have the same depth, and to shade them you'll need to do something else other than just use the same colour. So you can shade them using analogous colours, their complement, something like neutral tint, but on their own they just don't often give the depth you need. So how can you actually use this value scale and value chart to help you with your paintings? Firstly, something that I do for all my students is I give them a grayscale reference photo as well as a colour. And this just allows you to focus more on the values without being distracted by colour, because colour is deceptive. Just because a colour is really bright and intense, it doesn't actually mean you should be using a lot of it with really deep values. Hue, which is another word for colour, saturation, another term for intensity, and value, another term for lightness or darkness, they're all different things. You can also build values in your paintings. You don't have to start at the darkest, or you're not going to have anywhere to go. The way that I like to approach my paintings is I'll do an underpainting, one wash of colour generally over the whole area of the painting first. Then I'll paint the darkest values in, and this for me is usually pupils or nostrils, and then I spend the rest of the painting bridging the gap between them. You can also create a value study sketch before you paint a full portrait, and what this does is give you a quick feel for where to put your highlights and your shadows. Some people like to do this in just grayscale, or some people also like to do another one in color as well, particularly if they're still umming and ahhing over a particular color scheme. So let's take a look at an example of actually painting something with one value versus multiple values. I'm just going to paint a simple spherical shape here. So pretend this is like a ball or something. In this first one, I'm just going to paint really one tone of color. I'm not trying to make it perfect, but I'm just painting it a pretty flat color. and you'll notice that it's not very exciting. It doesn't look very realistic at all. It just looks like a circle. But now moving on to a second example, if I start with a really pale value here and then slowly start adding my deeper values to it and doing things as well, like following the shape around. So notice I'm not painting in straight lines or anything, I'm curving it around the shape of the object. And now I'm rinsing off and dabbing off excess color from my brush to be able to blend and carry out a lighter value of that one through the middle towards the opposite side. This is going to create the effect that we have a light source coming down from the top left corner, hitting the ball or the sphere, and then casting a shadow on the opposite side. So it can take some time and practice to shade things in a way that looks realistic. You know, like I said, I didn't just cut the circle in half and paint one side really dark and one side really light. I'm trying to blend things. I'm trying to make a bit of a gradient. I'm trying to curve the color around the edges. It can take time to get used to doing this. And now I'm going to dip back into my deeper value, my deeper color on the palette, and I want to create a shadow to ground the object and make it look like it is casting a shadow on the floor. So I'm going really up close to the sphere, right underneath it, and then I'm dragging it out. Now, how far you drag this out, and you can experiment with this, will make it look like it's got different lighting. You know, if I really stretched that shadow out all the way to the edge of the paper, it's going to look like the light source, let's say it's the sun, is setting. Whereas if I just did a tiny little shadow really close under it and didn't stretch it out at all, it might make it look like it's noon and there's hardly a shadow being cast underneath it at all because the light source is directly above. I would then have to adjust where the light source is hitting the sphere because it should be at the top if that's what I'm doing. But given I've already established the light source is coming from the top left, I need to create my shadow on the bottom right. And so I'm using a similar thing, you know, I'm placing color down, I'm using my brush to kind of drag it out. Watercolor goes where water is. And now I've created a really nice soft shadow on the floor or the ground. I think I could have had some lighter values in there a little bit more. It does look a bit stark on reflection. But what I'm going to do now is just show you the effect of layering and repeating the process, because often when I'm painting realistic things, one layer is not enough even if you have colors with lots of deep values in them. So I'm just going to basically repeat the process, but I'm focusing on the darker values because I don't want to add too much to my highlight or it's just going to start to take away that shine. And this also usually takes out any blotchiness, because if you have a look at the first example there, even though I didn't preserve anything for a highlight, it dried a little bit blotchy. This can just happen with watercolor. So drying that off now, and you can see that just smoothed things out a little bit more. It's still not completely perfect, and also I didn't paint the edges fully round either, but it looks a lot more realistic. I mentioned earlier that if you have a color that doesn't have a great depth of values in it, you can shade it other ways instead of just using it to shade itself. You can use analogous colors, you can use complementary colors to create a neutral, or you can use something like neutral tint, but you can actually tint, tone, and shade colors too. So what I'm going to do here is show you tinting, toning, and shading, which is where you use a white, a gray, or a black to adjust that color. Now in watercolor, we wouldn't typically use white. If we were going to tint a color, really what we would do is use water. So I will swatch out a value chart just like I did with the previous color, Payne's Grey and Winsor Lemon, just so you can see this color when diluted. But I'll also show you what it does look like when we add white. I'll be honest, sometimes I do use white to tint colors in watercolor portraits, even though the art police would have me incarcerated. I just think sometimes it works really well. For me, I love using it for pinky colors on cat noses. There's something about adding white, adding a bit of opacity to the color that to me just works really well on cat noses. So I'm going to continue doing that and nobody can stop me. But it might not be something you want to turn to for a large part of your painting. So as you can see, this color can achieve a number of values, but what you're going to see is an even greater amount of shades we can achieve if we tone and shade them in particular. Let's have a look now at the tints, tones, and shades that we can achieve with watercolor. And by the way, I'm just using my own handmade paints for this. I will list their color names and pigment numbers in the description if you're interested. So I'm going to add some white to my mixture on my palette and then start swatching that down, and I'll do the same technique of just like dipping the tip of my paintbrush in a little bit of water just to get rid of a bit of color and continue swatching that. So as you can see, we get a really nice pastel looking color. By the end of this, it doesn't look too different from using water to dilute it. I will just say, like, the added opacity you get is really the benefit for me, and using it for something that looks quite dense and opaque like a cat's nose. I often find that for things like that, you could use water to dilute your color, but I feel like to actually shade it, you need more layers than if you were to use something like white, because you've just got to build the color up differently. Because if you just keep glazing a lighter shade over itself over and over again, eventually it's just going to become dark. But we're going to get some really different colors now as we add gray, and we are going to get some tones here. And I just really love the different shades we're able to get from this really bright, vibrant quinacridone red. Using gray has definitely taken some of the intensity out of this color, but you could also use something like its complement, in this case a green, to do a similar thing. And now we are going to add black to our mixture and create some shades. The reason people will use black to shade a color is so that they're not actually changing it like if you were to use green. But I really just think it depends on what you're trying to use it for, how big of an area you want to paint this in. I find that using white or black in large areas can just really take away the magic of a painting. So it's really up to you, but I love these colors. I love the depth of these colors, and you can still see that intense red in there. It's just really toned down. So let's have a look at all of these colors dried now. And as you can see, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Just another way that you can stretch your color mixes even further. So don't be afraid to have a play around with creating tints, tones, and shades, whether you use a white watercolor or gouache instead, or just use water. The final thing I want to leave you with is you don't have to stay exactly true to the values that you find in your reference photo. Sometimes, and I find this particularly with watercolor, if you're translating a grayscale reference photo over to a painting, sometimes it just ends up too dark. You can see from my two little crocodiles here, the first one I painted, and I painted them about a year apart, it was just so dark and heavy. And I found myself stuck in this little hole for a while of really making my paintings way too dark, and it got to a point where if someone looked at it, they probably couldn't guess what medium I painted it with, if I even painted it at all. Maybe it was colored pencil in their mind. And so for me, being a watercolor artist, it became important that something about watercolor and the medium got to shine through. Whether that was transparency, blooms, or something like that, I just wanted there to be a bit more of a lightness and an airiness to my work. So I don't always stick true to the values in the reference photo. As long as you adjust all of them consistently, you'll be fine, and it will still turn out realistic. I hope this video helped you understand what values are a little bit better and how you can use them in your portraits to create something much more realistic. And I hope the tinting, toning, and shading also helped you figure out how you can stretch your color mixes even further. I'll catch you in the next video where we're going to paint something monochromatic together. I'll see you then.